Everything is one interactive energy. And it just so happens that human beings coalesce into form through DNA and energetic cooperation. The particles cooperate with a map of DNA to appear as a human being. And they cooperate, these molecules, particles, the body, all these chemicals, and forms this biology. And this biology has a cooperation in cells while that human being is alive. And those cells seem to cooperate with an intelligent cooperation that we call being alive. And when that heart stops, or the brain stops, or whatever stops cooperating, these cells, part of the cooperation of the cells, then that cooperation of cells forming a human body and aliveness, a personality, it feels like a separate me being. It's just life cooperating this way for a while, expressing this way for a while. Amazing, fascinating, and not taking anything away from this beautiful expression of being a human being. That is the person. It's just not what the person is assumed to be, which is a separate entity that is never looked at. It's just coalescing a certain way, sort of whirlpooling in form, but always connected to the whole. Everything is one. Every human being is actually part of the oneness, the wholeness, the completeness. No understanding of how that works. It doesn't need to be, except from the perspective of a separate me who needs to try and control and understand the complexity of life. In fact, human beings don't even try to acknowledge that that complexity is actually there. We just do what we do as human beings, and that's summarize and sort of sweep over a whole range of knowledge and experiences and interactions, and say, I don't need to worry about all of that stuff, really. I don't need to even look at it. I will just assume that this bit is what it is, what I know, and therefore that's easy, and move on. But if we actually open, even if we just open to look at the complexity of a blade of grass, or a leaf, or a finger, or a human being, or a brain, one would just say the complexity of that is a mystery. We have the smaller intelligence, or the limited supposed intellect of a human being, but it is a subset, or it's a part of the whole. The mysterious, complete intelligence of this everythingness, all encompassing, all connected everythingness that this is. And somehow this expresses into form. This is vibrating energy in all potentiality. They've talked in physics and science about probability waves. So it's not really a particle, or it's not a wave. It's both, until it needs to make a decision. The universe needs to make a decision on where it is and what it is, and then that collapses. It's the double slit experiment. If you haven't looked into it, it's a fascinating thing to confuse the mind and open the mind and say, we don't really know. And that's enough. That opening is enough to sort of start the opening process. That can be part of the awakening process, actually. Because when that's open to, it's like an all-embracing openness, instead of a I know how it is, controlling, separate self-thinking. Whatever we think we are controlling, and whatever importance we've placed upon it, is actually a mental construct based usually from the conditioning of feeling like a separate self throughout a lifetime, and applying that perspective to everything that comes, every logic. It's the starting point of our logic and way things are. And when that starts to undermine, when that starts to crumble and starts to be much more open, then it feels like a quantum processing rather than a linear, stifled processing. A quantum processing means it's open to all the flow of intelligence of this moving forward and answering itself, rather than this perspective, as John deciding I know how I've been taught and I know what I've learnt and I know what my genetics sort of predispose me to think, and the answer must fall within that small, limited, finite, contracted thinking process. Now that can give answers based on what's already been experienced, and that can summarize and keep the body safe. But we're not necessarily talking about just keeping alive, avoiding a tiger or in the ancient times where we were based on survival. Or you might be in a true survival situation where these things might be very useful to make quick decisions to stay alive. So there are times when it's useful to have this very limited perspective. But if the conditioning of the mind, if the habitual patterns of the human brain start to incorporate this openness, this open, for want of a better word, quantum problem solving or understanding of the way the world is, which is never really understandable, but it's just open, completely complex and expressing. If that becomes part of the repertoire of the human mind and the way it thinks, once that is habitualized, once that becomes a new kind of conditioning, which we're not educated with when we're children. We're educated to think linear, very, very restricted, in a restricted separate self manner. But if that starts to incorporate into the thinking process of the human being that's interacting in all of this, then that becomes accessible also, even during times of acute, perhaps physical danger. People might have a memory or a situation where they've gone, oh, I just reacted, I didn't have time to think, and if I had thought, I probably would have stuffed it up. I remember I was driving on a motorway in Europe, and I had two infants in the back, and my then wife was asleep, and there was a car upside down with the lights off in the middle of the motorway up ahead. It looked like I thought it was a paper bag, and there was no thought. There was complete calm, this calm that has now become more apparent, more integrated, more abiding. But that in that moment, and I was certainly a contracted, controlling separate self-character in those days. Even with that, during a driving situation at high speed on a motorway, seeing just the appearance of a brown paper bag on the road, thinking, what is that? And then when getting closer, realizing that was just, I think, the rear view mirror on the side of the car, but actually there was a black car upside down on its roof across two lanes in the middle of the motorway, and I was heading straight for it. And there was just absolute calmness in that split second to just make a decision which way to drive around the car, and also not to overreact and go off the road myself and die. It would have been death. Either hit the car and die or go off the road and die. It was just an absolute calm, just in the right amount to steer gently around this vehicle. Quite a substantial change in direction. And at that time, this was that intelligence. It was a greater intelligence that was flowing, and it was completely calm. There was no concern. That's always available, but most of the time we think we've got a better way to do it. So it's an integration of these things. That is part of awakening. It's awakening to not really being in control, because the one that we think is in control is actually part of a summarization or a separation process done in thought. The biological instinct for survival in animals and people, human beings, and all sorts of things. If you look at trees and plants and animals, we'll look at nature. We'll look at trees and plants. There's an instinct for the plant to survive. It bends and it finds more sun. It doesn't necessarily have anything personal against the other trees it's going above to take the sun from, and the tree below doesn't feel undermined or diminished by the fact that the other tree has been more powerful, even if that dies. It's just happening this way. There's probably shared resources in the minerals, in the roots in the soil, and all of these things, they warn each other. So there is a cooperation in nature, and probably an intelligent survival growth mechanism even in trees and nature. We're just simplifying things into some very concrete objects. Trees, animals have a survival instinct, a biological survival instinct to stay alive and procreate. And things may happen, and an animal will react, and an animal may feel emotional about certain things, but they're all short-lived because the thinking process doesn't self-perpetuate the agony of things when they don't go according to that best survival circumstance. Whereas human beings have evolved with self-reflective thought. I'm thinking these thoughts, and I am separate, and I need to look after this body. So it gives us a higher degree of self-preservation, but at the same time, it then starts blaming itself in thought for when it doesn't go quite right, or the circumstances of life, the complexity unfolds this way, and I should have seen that coming, or done it better, or I did this way, and I'm responsible for how well it went. Aren't I good? So all of these things happen in human thought, which are an interesting extension of this. Human beings can also create so much suffering directed back at the supposed separate doer of all of this complexity, the me, and I didn't do it well enough, and it can end up being very, very self-destructive in all sorts of degrees. So, and another aspect of that, it can sacrifice its life. It can override the biological instinct for loved ones that might be in danger, or it can go to the horrors of war, and there can be heroes that sacrifice themselves for the others. And these are beautiful expressions of humanity, not the war aspect, but just this being able to be selfless is a beautiful expression of humanity kind of seeing itself and overriding the instinct for separate biological survival because it is part of this whole. Now, the thinking process doesn't necessarily express that way, but that might be what's going on under the surface.